That's plain, okay. Yeah, so in order to imagine new towns, we need to demand the impossible. Why? Because our UK is facing many crises. The NHS is in crisis, the schools are in crisis, our government is in crisis. We are facing staggering homelessness crises. Many of our families and children are suffering from abject poverty. Racism, fascism on the rise, our culture, or rather our cultures, in crisis. And of course, we are facing a housing crisis of a magnitude not faced since the end of the Second World War. People are being dispossessed and displaced of their homes, and there's nowhere for many to go. And we are here to talk about creative placemaking. Don't get me wrong, we do need to build entirely new cities, towns, villages, and we need to build them all over the UK, not just centred in South East England or select areas. We need to share our infrastructures. We need to build new economies that deal with a a London-centric economic focus that sucks the life and people from every other area and region of the UK. We need to imagine the radically critical utopias in order to do this. We need new towns and cities that are well connected, in every sense of the word, that are capable of mitigating this climate catastrophe that our country and the world faces, that can make people's lives worth living again, as we've seen before. We need these new places to have all the facilities our future generations will need. We need community centres and sports facilities and green spaces. Where have they all gone? Why have they all gone? These are questions we need to answer. We need our communities. We need to re-find our community spirits that were once there, because capitalism and neoliberalism have devastated our communities and our ways of being and living together creatively. We must demand the impossible. Unfortunately, creative placemaking does not demand the impossible. Instead, it reproduces and reinforces the already possible, and it does this over and over and over again. Pretty bunting, patches of artificial grass, rainbow pedestrian crossings, bikeable, walkable, safe spaces, commissioned street art, quirky sunflower street signs, saccharine sweet salves to the onward march of neoliberal capitalism that is well versed in distinguishing its heartlessly selfish greed behind colourful and fun symbols. I've written extensively my critique of creative placemaking elsewhere, and I won't rehearse it again now. But rather, I would like to argue today that we need to take back our existing cities and towns and villages from the grabbing hands of capital and profit. We need to take back our towns and cities and villages before they are even built, new ones, while they're being built. We have a right to the city and other places in which we live, and we must exercise this right to the city by demanding what appears to be impossible. We need to organise ourselves, and we need to demand that at every level, to the most local levels possible, that we as people are able to participate in the planning of our social, economic and political systems. We live in, and this is becoming increasingly apparent as each day passes, a failing representative democracy that has always favoured the few, not the many. We need to rethink this political system. We need to put people at the heart of everything that we do, every decision we make, and planning our homes and our children's homes and our children's children's homes is crucial to this. I'm talking about a radically different shift towards devolved local decision-making and planning that puts trust in people who are going to have to live there and whose children will live there. Because our rights have never been gifted to us before, and they will certainly not be gifted to us now. We've always had to struggle, and it is struggle that is behind my notion of place guarding. Something very different, yet in some ways rather similar to creative placemaking, or whatever else we want to call it. Creative placemaking is ultimately a state and local authority-led policy filtered down to arts institutions and then on to artists and down to participants and audiences via agencies, funders and a raft of philanthropic foundations, NGOs and charities. Agencies typically seek to empower marginalised people and places through a mixture of socially engaged art, outreach, community art, education projects. We've seen some examples. Whilst creative placemaking, and we've also seen many good examples, whilst creative placemaking could avoid the criticism that it is simply remaking places to fit white middle-class norms, thereby effectively serving to gentrify neighbourhoods, it's quite simply, I argue that instead it serves as a toolkit for state, local, authority-led governance, planning and design principles that are tied to false forms and notions of participation, diversity and inclusion. Place Garden is different. It puts people first, not place. It puts the people who are already there. It puts the people who are going to live there. It puts their children there. It also puts the past memories and the people now gone in those places. In the case of new towns, Place Garden would put existing people, because there are existing people in these places. There is no such thing as an empty space, alongside new participants. And just as I am doing in communities that do already exist, it enables people to think about and plan using creative processes where and what they may need to go forward, and for people in authority positions to actually listen to them. Place Garden is about demanding the impossible. This impossible is, of course, possible. It is a realisable utopia. And utopia stands in opposition to the present culture and against the dominant ideology that controls our social, political and economic thinking on every level, with mantras like "there is no alternative." Critical utopia seeks to imagine new visions, infinite alternatives that have not yet been realised, but which are imminently realisable. And this type of thinking is about hope for a better world and a radically different world from the one in which we live today, really, really, really based on hope. It is about thinking about both what has and what has not yet been achieved, about visualizing futures that go beyond a commodity society and a global economy based on exploitation of humans and nature and natural resources. This type of thinking is about this critical utopias imagine futures that cannot be fully articulated because they do not yet exist. Henri Lefebvre, in Critique of Everyday Life, wrote, "Our towns may look like a book. They show us the history of power, of human possibilities, whilst becoming increasingly broad, have at the same time been increasingly taken over and controlled." Lefebvre points out that it is not academics or populists or middle-class people or even artists on their own who are best placed to decide upon the everyday lives of working-class people, of the majority of people. Working-class people and communities should instead be trusted to build their places their way, and they make their spaces and produce their spaces that they need, want and desire together. Rethinking our cultures is clearly part of that. We must break free of a limited and narrow definition of culture and instead accept that, in the words of Raymond Williams, culture is ordinary. It exists in the everyday. It is everyday life. And it is only by being trusted to fully participate in the unfilled possibilities of that everyday life and our cultures and our cultural activities that everyone can begin to experience the possibilities of a concrete human existence. And this is because space is socially produced. And to socially produce space based on the principles of neoliberal capitalism transforms such spaces into commodities to be produced, distributed and consumed. And this, I argue, is the language that often is used in creative placemaking. Utopia is tomorrow's possibilities. Only by placing the working class people at the forefront of the political agenda, of which planning is a part, can we profoundly modify life and open another era. This is a radical change from the way we live today. It's not a superficial change offered by the Trojan horse of creative placemaking. Rather, we must demand the impossible and demand it now. The impossible is possible, but only if we decide to make it so. The possibilities of living and being creatively can be imagined now. They can be imagined together, but only if we're serious about participatory democracies, dealing with class, oppression, and other forms of oppression, and about thinking about cultural democracy, real cultural democracy at local levels. Imagine what our cities and towns could be. Let's not make the same mistakes again that we've made before. We must look to the futures together, and that means radical system change. We know it. I argue we're frightened to actually deal with it. We must plan our futures together. We must take back our cities, new and old. And we must trust people who will live in our towns and cities to make that decision. There are many people working on putting people ahead of place. I'm working, for example, in Middlesbrough with the council there to put local services first. The council asked, why won't people vote for me? They said, well, you won't listen. They commissioned me to listen. They listened. The council said, what should we do now? I said, why not act on some of the things that the people want? And miraculously, amazing results were achieved. There are some things in this world that are quite very, very simple and that we've become entrenched in our ways of thinking. I'm working in Cardiff with the Creative Commons Cardiff, a policy initiative to safeguard and expand grassroots culture in a new city-wide arts alliance with over 100 arts organisations and artists, working with the council, with Arts Council of Wales, with lots of big organisations and small. Very exciting. In pit villages to take back land, looking at the models we've talked about. We've mentioned cooperative, mutual land, trusts, etc., etc. That sounds terrible. Yeah. And I'm also a co-organiser for the movement of cultural democracy, which is developing a radically different grassroots-based approach to rethinking our cultures within a participatory democracy and looking at radically redistribution of arts funding to as local a level as possible, along with decision-making about what is and isn't art, what people want to spend their money on within these communities. And we've seen some brilliant examples before. Mark Purcell said, "The possible world is a long way off, yet it is simultaneously right in front of us." So let's begin by imagining our new places and reimagining our existing places together. We can and must be radical. We can do things differently. Imagine the places where we live and will live in the future, as John Berger, for example, imagines fields. And I quote, "Remember what it was like to be sung to sleep. If you are fortunate, the memory will be more recent than childhood. The repeated lines of words and music are like paths. These paths are circular, and the rings they make are linked together like those of a chain. You walk along these paths and are led by them in circles which lead from one to the other, further and further away. The field upon which you walk and upon which the chain is laid is the song." So let's reimagine life and let's be creative and critical in the ways that we demand the seemingly impossible. And let's make radically new possibilities possible today. Let's reconnect to ourselves, reconnect to our nature, to our cultures, to nature. And to do this, we need a revolution in our everyday life and our everyday lives and our everyday cultures. We do not need art or artists or commodities popped into convenient little boxes anymore. Thank you.